I'm going to go over a couple of the forms of cost sharing that we see. This won't cover everything, but I think covers the main types that we actually end up seeing. Cash, of course, cash contributions are a lot of times what investigators are really looking for, and I think a lot of times they think that that's what agencies are looking for as well. So any cash contribution that's used for cost sharing, it has to come from an allowable, non-sponsored source. So that's an appropriated account, appropriated fund, discretionary funds, endowments, gifts. It can be used to fund basically any direct costs that would normally be considered allowable on the sponsored portion of the project. Salaries, fringe benefits, travel, capital equipment. But it's important to always remember that for a cost to be considered allowable cost sharing, it actually has to be acceptable on the sponsor side of funding as well. So for something to be an allowable cost on the cost share side, it has to be an allowable cost on the sponsored side as well. Another form of cost sharing that we see frequently is effort. So an effort commitment, of course, represents a contractual obligation to a project. Anytime a faculty member commits effort to a project without actually requesting the salary associated with that effort, they're making a cost sharing commitment, whether they realize they're making a cost sharing commitment or not. Because at that time, the university or institution is assuming the cost of that investigator's effort, inclusive of salary and fringe. So this can occur at the proposal stage, often to meet a voluntary commitment or to a voluntary committed commitment to show institutional support, or to meet a mandatory commitment. We also hear connected to effort salary cap cost sharing, which it occurs when investigators' base salary is larger than usually a federally designated cap on salary. We see this, of course, most with NIH. As Elizabeth mentioned, the NIH cap recently went down, so institutions have been really affected by that, covering that cap gap, especially when you have an institution that has a significant amount of NIH funding. Those institutions are even more affected by the salary cap cost sharing. So this is certainly a cost sharing that is not going to be going away. Another form of cost sharing is unrecovered F&A. Indirect costs are real costs associated with conducting sponsored activity. So if allowable direct costs are cost shared, the indirect costs associated with these direct costs can no longer be charged, but they still represent a quantifiable loss. The institution is now taking on the burden of covering that funding. So we should always represent that as cost sharing. Similarly, if you have a situation where there is a sponsor-designated cap on the F&A, either a flat rate or based on a specific percentage, that gap between what you're allowed to charge and your institution's designated applicable F&A rate should also be considered cost sharing. So that means you can also cost share on the costs that were on the sponsor side based on that F&A gap. I want to note that, especially in the latter type of situation, it's very important to make sure you count unrecovered F&A as cost sharing at the proposal stage. Otherwise, in a lot of situations, you'll want to make sure you go back to the sponsor and confirm that it's an approvable way to cost share. Graduate student fellowships are another good form of cost sharing. So these represent any salary and stipend, associated fringe benefits as applicable, and also tuition that's provided to support graduate students. Different institutions handle graduate student fellowships in different ways, but typically either at the department level, the school level, or at the central level, and maybe a central graduate school, there's a certain amount of graduate student fellowships that are provided or appropriated on an annual basis. So being able to use those graduate student fellowships and count them as cost sharing, it doesn't actually require necessarily a new outlay of cash funding, but it's also a good way to meet a mandatory threshold or to demonstrate a commitment to a project. Third-party cost sharing is provided by an entity external to the institution, a third party. So their commitments and expenditures need to follow the same guidelines that the prime institutions would. So we see sub-awardee cost sharing. This is probably the main type of third-party cost sharing most institutions see. If the prime institution is providing cost sharing, it's reasonable to expect that they'll also want their sub-awardee to provide cost sharing. You also see contributed time or services from an extramural party, often industry if you're a university, and also donated equipment. There are other things that can count as third-party cost sharing, but I think those three items probably cover the main, with sub-awardee cost sharing being the main third party that you do see. Yes?
Question. I'm not sure I understood why the graduate student fellowships were considered cost sharing. Is that if they're not providing as much as it would cost to have a graduate student, or I didn't understand.
Sure. If a graduate student will actually be working on the project and the manner in which the investigator or the department uses to fund them is off a graduate student fellowship. So graduate student fellowships often are just inclusive of salary, any fringe, if your institution charges it on graduate student stipends or salaries, and then their tuition. If you're going to say the graduate student will be working 100% on this sponsored project and will provide this fellowship to cover their cost, you can count that as cost sharing.